The rain in the city never really stopped. It merely changed its cadence, shifting from a violent, drumming downpour that choked the gutters to a silent, ghostly mist that clung to the neon signs and turned the asphalt into a mirror of fractured light. Julian walked with his head bowed against the damp chill, his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his frayed trench coat, his boots clicking a rhythmic, lonely beat against the cobblestones of the old quarter. He did not have a destination in mind, for destinations required a sense of purpose. And purpose was something Julian had misplaced many years ago in the blurred transitions between youth and graying adulthood. The streets here were narrow, winding like the internal passages of a labyrinth that forgot its own center, flanked by tall, leaning brick buildings that seemed to whisper to one another in the dark. It was on one of these forgotten corners, where the street lamps flickered with a dying, amber hum, that he saw the sign. It was a heavy piece of weathered oak, hanging by rusted chains that groaned in the wind, bearing words carved so deeply they seemed to bleed shadows. The archive of forgotten things, a sudden gust of wind, sharp and smelling of distant ozone and ancient paper, pushed Julian toward the door. The wood was dark, almost black, and the brass handle was cold enough to bite through his skin. When he pushed it open, a small copper bell chimed overhead, not a bright, welcoming ring, but a low, resonant note that vibrated in his chest like the strike of a distant cathedral clock. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, smelling of dried lavender, vanilla, binding glue, and the unmistakable scent of time itself, that dry, static aroma that accumulates when things are left undisturbed for centuries. The shop was cavernous, expanding far beyond what the modest exterior should have allowed. Shelves of dark, unpolished mahogany stretched upward into the gloom, disappearing into a vaulted ceiling where cobwebs hung like tattered lace. There were no light bulbs. Instead, thousands of beeswax candles burned in silver candelabras, their flames dancing in an invisible draft, casting long, liquid shadows that skittered across the floorboards. Can I help you find something? Or are you simply looking for a place to hide from the storm? The voice was thin, dry as autumn leaves scraping across pavement. Julian turned to see an old man sitting behind a massive counter made of a single, gnarled tree root. The man's face was an intricate map of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, cloudy blue that seemed to look not at Julian, but through him into the space directly behind his shoulder. He wore a velvet coat of an indistinguishable color, perhaps once crimson, now faded to the shade of dried rose petals, and his long, skeletal fingers were busy polishing a pocket watch that had no hands. "I'm just walking," Julian said, his own voice sounding foreign to him in the immense quiet of the room. "I didn't mean to intrude." "No one intrudes here, young man," the shopkeeper replied, his lips curving into a mirage of a smile. "And no one arrives by accident. The archive only reveals its door to those whose pockets are heavy with things they cannot see, and whose hearts are empty of the things they need. Look around, but be mindful of what you touch. Some things here are looking for a way out." Julian nodded slowly, a cold shiver tracing the line of his spine. He turned away from the counter and began to wander down the first aisle. The shelves were packed not only with books, but with an absurd, chaotic collection of miscellany. There were glass jars filled with colored smoke that swirled in slow, agonizing circles, iron keys of every shape and size, tied together with faded silk ribbons, pocket watches with cracked faces, dried flowers that still held a ghost of their original color, and thousands of unlabeled leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and peeling like old skin. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over a row of small, silver thimbles, before moving on. The further he walked into the labyrinth of shelves, the quieter the world outside became. The sound of the rain vanished entirely, replaced by a low, collective murmur sound like a million people whispering their secrets at the very edge of his hearing. It wasn't unpleasant, but it carried an overwhelming weight of melancholy that made his lungs feel tight. He stopped in front of a shelf that seemed older than the rest, its wood blackened by time or fire. On it lay a single, large book bound in cracked, dark brown leather. It had no title, no gold lettering, no ornaments. Yet Julian felt an inexplicable tug in the center of his chest, a magnetic pull that drew his hand toward the spine. The moment his fingertips brushed the leather, a spark of static electricity snapped between his skin and the book, causing him to gasp. He pulled the volume from the shelf. It was surprisingly heavy, as if the pages within were made of lead rather than paper. He carried it to a nearby reading alcove where a single candle sputtered in a brass holder. Sitting down on a velvet armchair that smelled of dust, Julian rested the book on his knees and hesitated. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, wild thumping that he hadn't felt in years. With a trembling hand, he opened the cover. The first page was entirely blank, a pale expanse of parchment that seemed to absorb the candlelight. But as Julian stared at it, the surface began to shimmer. The pale fibers of the paper rippled like water, and slowly, lines of ink began to bleed upward from the depths of the page, forming an image. It wasn't a drawing or a photograph. It was alive. The lines shifted and focused until Julian was looking down into a sunlit garden. He gasped, his grip tightening on the edges of the book. He was looking at the backyard of his childhood home. He saw the old oak tree with the tires swaying gently in a summer breeze that he could almost feel against his cheek. And there, running across the grass, was a young boy of about 7 years old. The boy had messy brown hair, scraped knees, and a laughter that Julian could suddenly hear ringing in his ears, a bright, clear sound completely unburdened by the weight of the world. Running alongside the boy was a golden retriever, its tail wagging furiously, its bark a muffled, happy thump against the silence of the shop. "Barnaby," Julian whispered. The name tearing from his throat like a sob. It was his dog. The dog he had loved more than anything in the world. The dog whose death had broken his young heart so completely that he had locked the memory away in a dark corner of his mind, refusing to ever think of him again. He had forgotten the exact shade of Barnaby's fur under the July sun. He had forgotten the way the dog would rest its heavy head on his knee when he was sad. For over 20 years, that memory had been buried beneath layers of adult cynicism, failed relationships, and the numbing routine of a life lived in grayscale. As he watched, the boy in the book stopped running. He turned towards the perspective of the viewer, looked directly into Julian's eyes, and smiled. It was a smile of pure, unconditional trust. A tear escaped Julian's eye, falling onto the page. The moment the water hit the paper, the image dissolved into a swirl of blue and gold ink, sinking back beneath the surface until the page was blank once more. Panicked, Julian frantically flipped to the next page. The parchment rippled again, and this time, the ink formed the interior of a small, cramped apartment filled with the smell of cheap coffee and oil paints. A young woman was standing by a window, her back to him, her long, dark hair caught in a messy bun with a paintbrush stuck through it. She was painting a canvas of a stormy sea, her movements wild and passionate. Julian's breath hitched. "Elena," the woman turned around, wiping a streak of blue paint across her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at him, or rather, looked at the memory of him, and laughed. It was the summer they were 22, living on nothing but dreams and instant noodles, believing they were going to conquer the art world together. Julian had been a writer then, his fingers constantly stained with ink, his mind on fire with stories. But then came the rejections, the bills, the crushing reality of rent, and the slow, insidious voice of doubt. He had abandoned his typewriter for a corporate desk job. She had kept painting, moving further and further into her art until the gap between them became an ocean they couldn't cross. They hadn't fought when they parted. They had simply faded out of each other's lives like an old photograph left in the sun. Julian reached out, his thumb gently tracing the contours of Elena's painted face on the paper. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the ghost in the book. "I'm so sorry I let us go out." Elena's image smiled sadly, gave a slight nod, and then she too dissolved into the paper, leaving behind only the faint scent of turpentine and old promises, page after page. Julian flipped through the volume of his own life. He saw things he didn't even realize he had lost. He saw his grandmother's hands, wrinkled and smelling of flour, teaching him how to knead dough. He saw the night he had stood on a rooftop in Paris, looking at the city lights and feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of infinite possibility, a belief that he could be anything, do anything. He saw the face of his father before the sickness took him, strong and laughing, throwing a baseball in the park. Each memory was a sharp, beautiful knife, cutting through the thick armor of apathy that Julian had built around his heart over the decade. He had thought he was protecting himself by forgetting, by not feeling, by adapting to a quiet, colorless existence where nothing could hurt him because nothing mattered. But looking at these pages, he realized the T.